When danger walks into a room, most people panic. But the rare ones simply start paying attention. The lunch crowd at Hawthorne Grill hummed with the comfortable rhythm of Manhattan's midday routine. Silverware chimed against porcelain, quiet business deals floated above white tablecloths, and sunlight filtered through tall windows onto polished marble floors. At the corner table sat Ethan Caldwell, a man whose name appeared in financial magazines almost as often as the stock market itself. At 38, Ethan had built a technology empire worth more than $3 billion, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to controlling outcomes. His navy suit fit perfectly, his Swiss watch rested neatly against his wrist, and the leather folder beside his plate contained a contract that could change the trajectory of an entire company. To Ethan, this lunch was simple math, numbers, leverage, timing. Across the room, however, someone else was watching the details he never noticed. Claire Bennett moved between tables with the smooth efficiency of someone who had memorized every step of the restaurant floor. She wore the same black apron as every other server, yet there was something about her stillness that set her apart. She didn't rush. She didn't chatter. She observed. When she poured coffee, her movements were steady. When customers spoke, she listened fully, as if each sentence mattered. Most guests never looked closely enough to see it. To them, she was simply the waitress refilling water glasses and clearing plates. Ethan noticed her only once at first, when she approached his table with a pot of fresh coffee. "Refill, sir?" she asked quietly. Her voice carried the calm tone of someone who had mastered patience. Ethan barely glanced up from the figures on his tablet. "Just a little," he replied, tapping a number into the contract draft. Claire tilted the pot, filling the cup with a precise, steady stream. Not a single drop spilled onto the saucer. "Thank you," Ethan muttered automatically, already returning to the numbers in front of him. But as Claire stepped away, his eyes lifted for a fraction of a second longer than usual. There was something unusual about the way she moved through the room. Not hurried like the other staff. Not nervous around wealthy guests. Just composed. A few minutes later, the restaurant door opened again. Two men entered wearing heavy jackets despite the mild spring. Afternoon outside. Most people didn't notice them right away. Conversations continued. Glasses clinked. A soft jazz melody drifted from the speakers above the bar. But Claire noticed three small details immediately. The way one man's eyes scanned the ceiling corners where security cameras were mounted. The way the other kept his left hand buried deep in his pocket. And the way both paused just a second too long near the entrance, studying the room before moving forward. Claire placed a tray on the counter slowly, her gaze steady but subtle. She didn't stare. She didn't react. She simply watched. At Ethan's table, none of this registered. He was reviewing a clause worth nearly $50 million when he heard the faint sound of a chair scraping across the floor behind him. The room grew strangely quiet, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Someone near the bar whispered something under their breath. Ethan finally looked up. Several diners had frozen in their seats, their eyes drawn toward the center of the room. The two men who had just entered were now standing still, their presence filling the restaurant with a tension no one could quite explain. Ethan felt the shift instantly, a subtle tightening in the air. For the first time that afternoon, the billionaire investor stopped thinking about contracts and numbers. He glanced around the room. That was when he saw her. Claire Bennett stood behind the coffee counter, her hand resting lightly on the handle of a stainless steel pot. The entire dining room had fallen into uneasy silence. Guests exchanged worried looks. One woman clutched her purse tightly. A man near the window slowly lowered his phone. Yet Claire's posture hadn't changed at all. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her breathing steady. And as Ethan watched her from across the restaurant, one realization struck him with unexpected clarity. Everyone else in the room looked afraid. Claire Bennett did not. The silence inside Hawthorne Grill stretched just a little too long. It was not loud panic, not shouting, not chaos. It was something quieter and more unsettling. The kind of stillness that spreads when every instinct in a room suddenly begins whispering that something is wrong. Ethan Caldwell slowly set his tablet down on the white tablecloth, his attention no longer on the contract worth millions of dollars, but on the strange tension filling the restaurant. Around him, people exchanged uncertain glances. A couple near the window stopped mid-conversation. The bartender paused while polishing a glass. Even the soft jazz music drifting through the speakers now felt oddly distant. Across the dining room, the two men who had entered moments earlier had moved farther inside, their presence shifting the rhythm of the room without a single raised voice. Ethan studied them carefully. As a businessman, he had spent decades reading people across negotiation tables, watching the subtle language of posture and tone. Something about these two did not match the relaxed environment of a midtown lunch crowd. Yet what unsettled him even more was not the men themselves. It was Claire Bennett. She was still standing behind the coffee counter exactly where he had seen her moments earlier, one hand resting on the metal handle of the coffee pot. Her expression had not changed. Not startled. Not confused. Just attentive. Ethan frowned slightly, leaning back in his chair. Most people in the room were clearly uncomfortable now. One older gentleman quietly slid his chair closer to the table, as if making himself smaller. A woman at a nearby table held her phone in both hands, but did not type anything, her eyes fixed toward the entrance. Yet Claire moved as though she were following a completely different rhythm. She picked up a clean cup from the counter and placed it neatly beside the coffee machine. She adjusted the stack of menus near the register. Each movement was small, precise, almost deliberate. It looked less like nervous activity and more like someone quietly preparing a space. Ethan could not explain why that detail unsettled him. Perhaps it was because her calm did not look forced. It looked practiced. The two men stepped farther into the restaurant now, pausing briefly near the center of the dining room. One of them spoke a few quiet words to the other. Their voices were too low for Ethan to hear clearly, but the tone carried across the room in a way that made several guests shift uneasily in their chairs. The manager behind the host's stand began walking slowly toward them, offering the polite smile that restaurants train into their staff. It was the same welcoming expression used for every guest who walked through the door. But halfway across the room, the manager slowed slightly, as if sensing that something about this interaction might not follow the usual script. Ethan felt the tension tighten again. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table. He had attended high-pressure boardroom negotiations, survived market crashes, and navigated billion-dollar acquisitions. Yet this quiet uncertainty felt strangely unfamiliar. Money could control many things. It could not control the atmosphere of a room like this. His eyes drifted back to Claire. She was watching the scene with a focus that seemed almost analytical. Not fearful, not curious, observant. Then something subtle happened that most people never noticed. A young girl sitting at a table near the aisle began to swing her legs nervously under her chair. The soft tapping of her shoes against the wood floor echoed in the silence. Claire glanced in that direction for only a second. Just a brief look. The girl immediately stopped moving, as if responding to a silent instruction. Ethan blinked, unsure whether he had imagined it. A moment later, Claire picked up a small order pad and wrote something quickly before sliding it across the counter toward the kitchen door. The cook glanced down at it, read the line, and nodded once before disappearing back inside. Ethan leaned forward slightly now, curiosity replacing confusion. Something was unfolding in the room, and Claire Bennett seemed to be the only person who understood the pattern. And for reasons he could not explain yet, the billionaire investor who had built an empire by predicting outcomes suddenly had the uneasy feeling that the quiet waitress across the restaurant was already several steps ahead of everyone else. The quiet tension inside Hawthorne Grill deepened, stretching across the dining room like invisible thread. Ethan Caldwell remained seated, his eyes following every movement now with a sharp focus that had nothing to do with contracts or investments. He had spent most of his life reading balance sheets and predicting markets, yet this moment required a different kind of observation. Across the room, the two men had stopped near the center aisle. One of them glanced toward the windows as if checking the street outside, while the other slowly scanned the room from table to table. Their expressions were controlled but intent, like men trying to memorize details. The restaurant manager stood a few feet away from them, still wearing the professional smile that hospitality training demanded. Yet even from his seat, Ethan could see the faint stiffness in the manager's posture. It was the kind of body language people showed when they were unsure whether to continue forward or step back. Conversations around the dining room had faded into low murmurs. Silverware rested untouched beside half-finished plates. A man near the bar quietly pushed his chair back an inch as if preparing to stand, then thought better of it and froze again. The entire room seemed to be waiting for something. Ethan's gaze returned once more to Claire Bennett. She had not moved quickly or dramatically. In fact, her movements were so subtle that most people probably would not have noticed them at all. After sliding the note toward the kitchen, she calmly wiped the coffee counter with a folded cloth. Then she adjusted the small row of ceramic cups beside the machine. Each action looked routine, almost ordinary, yet Ethan began to sense a pattern in what she was doing. She was not just tidying the counter. She was positioning things. When the cook briefly pushed the kitchen door open again, Claire gave him the smallest nod before placing a tray of glasses closer to the edge of the counter. The cook immediately stepped back inside, and a few seconds later Ethan heard the faint click of the back hallway door closing somewhere beyond the kitchen. The sound was quiet enough that most people never registered it. Ethan did, and suddenly he realized something that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Claire was quietly preparing the room. Not reacting. Preparing. The difference was enormous. The two men in the center aisle exchanged another glance. One of them stepped closer to the host's stand, speaking in a calm but firm voice that carried just enough across the dining room for Ethan to catch fragments of the sentence. It was not a request for a table. It was something else entirely. The manager nodded slowly while raising both hands slightly in a gesture that suggested cooperation rather than resistance. A ripple of unease spread through the guests. Someone at the far table whispered something under their breath. Ethan felt the same tightening sensation he had felt moments earlier, the instinctive awareness that the situation had shifted into something serious. Yet again his eyes drifted toward Claire. She picked up the coffee pot once more and walked toward a nearby table where an older couple sat frozen in their seats. Her voice was soft but steady as she spoke to them. "Would you like some more coffee?" she asked, as if nothing unusual were happening at all. The woman nodded automatically, grateful perhaps for the simple normality of the moment. Claire poured the coffee carefully, the stream perfectly steady. Ethan watched that small detail with growing disbelief. The entire room was on edge, and this woman poured coffee with the calm precision of someone performing a practiced routine. Then, as Claire set the pot down, she glanced across the dining room directly toward Ethan. It was not a long look, just a brief meeting of eyes. But in that instant Ethan felt an unexpected jolt of recognition. Her expression carried no panic, no confusion, only a quiet message he could not quite translate yet. Stay still. Stay calm. Trust the moment. The billionaire investor who had built his life on strategy suddenly understood something surprising. Claire Bennett was not simply remaining calm inside a tense situation. She was guiding it. For several seconds the room remained suspended in a strange balance between normal life and something far more serious. Ethan Caldwell could feel it in the way people breathed, in the careful stillness of every guest at Hawthorne Grill. No one was speaking loudly anymore. Even the music overhead seemed quieter, as if the room itself had decided to listen. Near the entrance, the two men continued their slow inspection of the restaurant. One of them now stood beside the host's stand, speaking calmly with the manager in a low voice that carried a tone of firm instruction. The manager nodded repeatedly, his earlier welcoming smile now replaced with a careful expression of compliance. The other man stepped farther into the dining area, pausing beside a table where two office workers sat with untouched salads. His presence alone was enough to make them sit perfectly still. Across the room, Claire Bennett continued moving with the same measured rhythm she had shown since the moment the men walked in. She placed the coffee pot back on the counter and wiped her hands calmly on a folded white towel. To anyone watching casually, she still looked like a waitress completing her afternoon duties. But Ethan Caldwell was not watching casually anymore. He had begun noticing every detail. Claire's eyes moved constantly, but subtly. First, toward the entrance, then toward the kitchen door, then toward the hallway that led to the restrooms. She was mapping the room. Ethan had spent his entire career studying patterns and probabilities, and now he recognized the same kind of strategic awareness unfolding in front of him. Claire was not simply staying calm. She was calculating. The man standing in the aisle turned slowly, his gaze drifting across the tables until it reached Ethan's corner. For a brief moment their eyes met. Ethan held the look without flinching. He had learned long ago that confidence, even silent confidence, could shape the outcome of tense encounters. The man studied him for another second before shifting his attention elsewhere. Several guests quietly lowered their heads toward their tables, pretending to examine their plates. The tension tightened again. Yet through it all, Claire continued to guide the atmosphere with small, almost invisible choices. She walked toward the bar and gently moved a tray of glass pitchers slightly farther back from the edge. She adjusted a chair that had been left half turned in the aisle. She spoke softly to the bartender, who nodded once before stepping away from the register and disappearing briefly into the back hallway. Ethan noticed every movement now, and with each one his curiosity deepened. Why would a waitress move so deliberately during a moment like this unless she understood something the rest of the room did not? A sudden clatter broke the silence when a fork slipped from someone's hand and tapped lightly against the floor. Several heads turned instantly. The sound echoed far louder than it should have in the tense quiet. The man in the aisle glanced toward the noise, his posture stiffening slightly. Before the room could react further, Claire stepped calmly toward the table where the fork had fallen. She bent down, picked it up, and placed a fresh utensil beside the plate with an easy smile. "No problem at all," she said gently to the embarrassed guest. Her voice was warm and steady, as if she were reassuring the entire dining room at once. The simple normality of her tone seemed to ripple outward, easing the sharp edge of the moment. Ethan watched her with growing disbelief. In a room filled with anxious executives, startled tourists, and a visibly nervous staff, the quietest person in the building had somehow become the center of stability. Then Claire turned slightly toward the coffee counter again, and as she did, she glanced once more across the room toward Ethan. The look lasted only a second, but it carried the same calm message as before. Do not panic. Do not move suddenly. Let the moment unfold. Ethan Caldwell slowly exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. And for the first time since the tension began, the billionaire investor made a decision he rarely made in any situation. He chose to trust someone else's strategy. The tension inside Hawthorne Grill had settled into a strange, fragile quiet, like the moment when a lake becomes perfectly still before the wind returns. Ethan Caldwell sat motionless at his corner table, every sense now alert. His contract, worth tens of millions of dollars, lay forgotten beside his untouched glass of water. In its place, his attention followed the subtle choreography unfolding across the room. The two men who had entered earlier continued moving slowly between the tables, their presence guiding the behavior of every person inside the restaurant. Guests sat straighter. Conversations stopped completely. The entire dining room had become careful, almost polite in its silence. Yet Ethan's focus remained fixed on Claire Bennett. The waitress had returned to the coffee counter, her movements calm and precise. She placed the metal pot back onto the warmer and folded the white towel beside it with deliberate care. There was nothing hurried about her actions, nothing dramatic. But now that Ethan had begun watching closely, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every movement she made seemed to influence the room. When she stepped toward the bar earlier, the bartender had quietly disappeared through the hallway behind the kitchen. When she spoke softly to the older couple, their nervous whispering stopped. When she picked up the fallen fork, the ripple of panic faded before it could grow. Claire was not controlling the situation through force or authority. She was guiding it through calm. Near the center aisle, one of the men now gestured toward the front windows, speaking quietly to the manager again. The manager nodded, his hands still slightly raised as if trying to show cooperation. Ethan could not hear the words clearly, but the meaning was obvious. The room was being instructed to remain calm and compliant. No one argued. No one resisted. Instead, people waited. That was when Ethan noticed another small detail. Claire had moved the tray of water glasses earlier so that it rested just within reach of the coffee counter. Now she lifted one glass, filled it slowly from the pitcher, and carried it across the room. She stopped beside the man standing in the aisle and held the glass out gently. "You look like you have been walking for a while," she said in a voice so steady it felt almost soothing. "Would you like some water?" The man hesitated for a brief moment. The offer was so ordinary, so unexpected in the tense silence, that it caught him slightly off guard. Finally, he took the glass. "Thank you," he replied quietly before taking a sip. The small exchange changed the atmosphere of the room in a way Ethan could almost feel. The man's shoulders lowered just slightly. The rigid edge in his posture softened. It was as if Claire had reminded him, and everyone else in the restaurant, That normal human interaction still existed inside the tension. Ethan leaned forward in his chair, studying her carefully now. This was not luck. This was skill. Claire Bennett understood something fundamental about people under pressure. Panic spread quickly, but calm spread faster when someone strong enough carried it. A moment later, Claire returned to the counter and rested her hands lightly on the polished surface. Her eyes moved once again across the room, measuring the distance between tables, the position of the men, the quiet reactions of the guests. Then her gaze paused on Ethan for a brief second. This time there was a faint hint of reassurance in her expression, as if she already knew the situation was moving toward a different ending than anyone else expected. Ethan Caldwell slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, the billionaire investor realized he was watching a form of leadership that could not be purchased, negotiated, or commanded. It came from something far quieter. The courage to remain steady when everyone else began to tremble. The quiet balance inside Hawthorne Grill continued to hold, but Ethan Caldwell could feel the subtle shift of momentum moving through the room. The man who had accepted the glass of water still stood near the aisle, his posture noticeably less rigid than before. He handed the empty glass back to Claire Bennett with a short nod of appreciation. Claire received it with the same calm expression she had maintained from the beginning, placing the glass back onto her tray without hurry. Around the dining room, guests remained seated exactly where they were, but their breathing seemed steadier now. Fear had not vanished, but the sharp edge of it had softened into something more manageable. Claire walked slowly toward the coffee counter again, her steps unhurried, her shoulders relaxed. As she passed Ethan's table, he noticed something he had missed earlier. She was not simply watching the two men. She was watching everyone. The young girl near the window, the elderly couple by the bar, the office workers at the center table. Claire's attention moved gently across the room like a quiet lighthouse beam, making sure no one panicked and no one did anything unpredictable. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar deals in boardrooms filled with powerful executives, yet he had never seen anyone command a room quite like this. Not through authority, not through intimidation, through composure. Near the entrance, the second man spoke quietly to the manager again before glancing around the restaurant one more time. His gaze lingered briefly on the guests, then on the exits, then finally across the room toward the coffee counter where Claire now stood. For a moment the two simply looked at one another. Claire did not lower her eyes. She did not challenge him either. Her expression remained neutral, almost thoughtful, as if she were observing a situation rather than reacting to it. The man seemed to study her in return, perhaps noticing the same thing Ethan had already realized. She was not afraid. After a few seconds he turned away again, shifting his attention back to the manager. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, processing the moment. The entire encounter had unfolded without raised voices, without chaos, without the panic that normally followed tense situations like this. And somehow Claire Bennett had guided that outcome simply by holding the emotional center of the room steady. Then something unexpected happened. A faint sound reached Ethan's ears from somewhere outside the restaurant. At first it was distant and almost unnoticeable, but within seconds the low hum grew clearer. Several people near the windows lifted their heads slightly. The two men near the entrance paused mid-conversation. Claire did not move immediately. She simply listened. The sound grew louder now, unmistakable in its meaning. Emergency vehicles approaching from several blocks away, their engines echoing faintly through the city streets. Ethan felt a quiet realization settle into his mind. The message Claire had written earlier. The bartender who had slipped through the hallway. The careful positioning of people and objects inside the room. None of it had been random. Claire had already prepared for this moment long before anyone else understood what was happening. The man standing near the aisle heard the distant engines too. His head turned slightly toward the front windows. For the first time since entering the restaurant, a trace of uncertainty crossed his face. Claire remained still behind the coffee counter, her hands resting lightly against the polished surface. Her breathing remained slow and even, her gaze steady. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft enough that only the nearest tables could hear it. "Everything is going to be all right," she said calmly. The words were not dramatic. They were simple, but in the quiet room of Hawthorne Grill, they carried a quiet authority that felt stronger than fear. The distant sound of approaching emergency vehicles grew louder outside, echoing faintly between the tall buildings of Midtown Manhattan. Inside Hawthorne Grill, every person in the room heard it now. The reaction was immediate but controlled. Several guests near the windows exchanged quick glances. One man tightened his grip on the edge of the table, as if steadying himself. Yet no one stood up. No one shouted. The fragile calm that had settled over the room still held. Ethan Caldwell remained seated, his eyes fixed across the dining room on Claire Bennett. The billionaire investor had experienced tense negotiations and corporate crises before, but never a moment quite like this. The quiet waitress standing behind the coffee counter seemed to carry the emotional balance of the entire room in her posture. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her breathing remained slow. Her eyes moved carefully from guest to guest, as if silently reminding each person to remain steady. Near the entrance, the two men heard the approaching vehicles as well. One of them turned slightly toward the front windows, his expression tightening as the distant engines grew clearer. For the first time since entering the restaurant, the certainty in his body language seemed to waver. The second man spoke to him quickly in a low voice, their words too quiet for most people to hear. But the shift in their posture was unmistakable. Something had changed. Claire did not move immediately. She simply observed. Her gaze moved from the men to the front door and then briefly toward the hallway that led behind the kitchen. Ethan realized she was measuring the final moments of the situation, calculating the outcome just as carefully as she had measured the tension earlier. Then Claire stepped away from the coffee counter and walked calmly toward the center of the dining room. Her steps were unhurried, her expression composed. The movement drew several curious glances from the guests, but no one spoke. When she reached the aisle, she paused just a few feet from where the two men stood. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear. "You might want to step outside," she said gently. "It sounds like someone has already called for help." The words were not threatening. They were simply factual. For a brief moment the room became perfectly still. The man holding the empty water glass earlier looked toward the door again as the approaching vehicles grew louder. The faint reflection of flashing lights now flickered across the front windows. The second man exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering in a small gesture of resignation. Without raising his voice, he said something quietly to his companion and then turned toward the entrance. Within seconds, both men walked calmly toward the door. No one tried to stop them. No one moved. The front door opened, letting in the sound of city traffic and the distant hum of emergency vehicles now turning onto the street outside. Then the door closed behind them, leaving the restaurant in a silence that felt almost unreal. For several seconds no one spoke. The tension that had filled the room slowly dissolved, replaced by the quiet disbelief of people realizing that the situation had ended without chaos. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his mind processing everything he had just witnessed. Across the room, Claire Bennett returned to the coffee counter as if nothing unusual had happened. She picked up the metal pot, poured a fresh cup for a waiting guest, and set it down with the same steady hand she had shown all afternoon. Watching her, Ethan felt a realization settle quietly in his mind. The most powerful person in the room that day had not been the millionaire with the expensive watch. It had been the waitress who never raised her voice. For a few long seconds after the door closed, Hawthorne Grill remained perfectly silent. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm passes, when people are still unsure whether the sky has truly cleared. Ethan Caldwell slowly exhaled and glanced around the dining room. Guests were beginning to move again, cautiously at first. A woman near the window placed her hand over her chest and released a breath she had clearly been holding for several minutes. The young girl who had been swinging her legs earlier now leaned toward her mother and whispered something softly. The bartender returned from the hallway behind the kitchen, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Claire Bennett. Claire gave him a small nod, almost imperceptible, and the bartender relaxed immediately. Outside, the sound of emergency vehicles grew louder as they arrived on the street in front of the restaurant. Red and blue lights flickered across the front windows, reflecting briefly on the polished marble floor. The manager moved quickly toward the entrance, opening the door just as several uniformed officers stepped inside. Their presence filled the doorway with calm authority, but the tension inside the room had already faded. The manager explained the situation quietly, gesturing toward the door where the two men had exited moments earlier. Several guests began speaking at once, their voices rising with the nervous energy that often followed a frightening moment. Ethan remained seated, still watching Claire. She stood behind the coffee counter exactly where she had been before, wiping the polished surface with the same folded towel she had used earlier. Her movements were steady, almost ordinary, as if the last 15 minutes had been nothing more than a brief interruption in the lunch service. One of the officers approached the counter and spoke to her in a calm voice, asking a few questions. Claire answered simply, her tone respectful but composed. She described what she had noticed when the men first entered, how she had quietly asked the bartender to alert the kitchen, and how someone had called for help from the back hallway. The officer listened carefully and nodded with quiet appreciation. Around the dining room, several guests began to glance toward Claire with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Word traveled quickly. From table to table, people began realizing what had happened. The calm voice, the steady movements, the way she had guided the atmosphere of the room without causing panic. Ethan finally stood from his chair, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket as he walked slowly across the restaurant. The officers were now speaking with the manager near the door, and the guests were returning gradually to their conversations, though the mood remained different now. Quieter, thoughtful. Ethan stopped a few feet from the coffee counter where Claire stood, placing clean cups back into their neat row. For a moment he said nothing. He simply studied her the way he studied complex negotiations and unexpected opportunities. Claire looked up and met his gaze with the same calm expression she had shown all afternoon. "Is there something else I can bring you, sir?" she asked politely. Ethan almost laughed at the normality of the question. He glanced at the untouched contract still sitting on his table and then back at her. "Actually," he said slowly, "I think you already brought something far more valuable than coffee today." Claire tilted her head slightly, curious but not surprised. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the counter, his voice thoughtful now. "I have spent most of my life believing that control comes from power, money, or authority," he said quietly. "But today I watched someone control an entire room with nothing but calm." Claire considered his words for a moment before offering a faint, thoughtful smile. "Sometimes people just need someone to remind them that panic is not the only option," she replied. Ethan nodded slowly, the lesson settling into his mind with surprising clarity. Around them the restaurant was slowly returning to its ordinary rhythm. Plates clinked softly. Conversations resumed. Yet for Ethan Caldwell, the world felt slightly different now, because the quiet waitress standing across the counter had just shown him a kind of strength that no balance sheet could measure. The afternoon light outside Hawthorne Grill had shifted slightly by the time the last police car pulled away from the curb. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere had almost fully returned to normal, though a quiet sense of reflection still lingered in the air. Plates moved across tables again, silverware clinked softly against porcelain, and the low jazz melody from the speakers resumed its gentle rhythm. Yet something subtle had changed among the people who had witnessed the events of the past half hour. They spoke a little more thoughtfully. They watched the room a little more carefully. And many of them, whether they realized it or not, occasionally glanced toward the coffee counter where Claire Bennett continued her work. Ethan Caldwell remained standing there for another moment after their brief conversation, studying the calm woman who had just reshaped his understanding of leadership without ever raising her voice. For years he had believed that influence belonged to those with the loudest authority or the largest resources. Yet the quiet waitress in front of him had proven that presence, patience, and clarity of mind could guide an entire room through tension without a single command. Claire placed another cup neatly into its place beside the coffee machine and reached for the stainless steel pot again. Her movements were the same as they had been before the entire incident began. Smooth, focused, ordinary. When she poured coffee for a nearby guest, she did it with the same steady precision Ethan had noticed earlier. Not a drop spilled onto the saucer. The guest thanked her warmly, offering a grateful smile that carried a new layer of respect. Claire returned the smile politely and continued her routine. Ethan glanced back toward his table where the contract still waited inside the leather folder. The numbers written on those pages represented deals that would shift markets, influence companies, and generate headlines in business magazines. But for the first time in years, the billionaire investor found that the figures in front of him no longer felt like the most important thing in the room. He turned back toward Claire again. If you ever decide you want a different career, he said thoughtfully, I suspect you could lead a boardroom full of executives without raising your voice either. Claire gave a soft laugh, the first real hint of amusement he had seen from her all afternoon. I think I will stay where I am for now, she replied gently. People come here every day carrying their own storms. Sometimes all they need is a place that feels steady. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the simplicity of her words. He realized that what she had done today was not extraordinary to her. It was simply the way she chose to exist in the world. Calm when others rushed. Observant when others reacted. Grounded when others lost balance. Around them, the lunch crowd continued to flow in and out of the restaurant. A new group of customers entered through the front door, unaware that anything unusual had happened earlier in the afternoon. They took their seats, glanced at the menus, and ordered drinks just like any other day. Claire greeted them with the same quiet professionalism she had shown all along. Watching this, Ethan Caldwell felt a quiet sense of humility settle into his thoughts. Wealth could build companies, influence markets, and shape entire industries. But the kind of strength he had witnessed today came from something far deeper than power. It came from character. As he gathered his folder and prepared to leave, Ethan paused once more at the coffee counter. Claire looked up briefly as he passed. Their eyes met for a second, and no words were necessary. Outside, the city continued moving at its usual relentless pace. But inside Hawthorne Grill, one quiet truth had revealed itself to everyone who had been there that afternoon. True strength does not always arrive with noise or authority. Sometimes it stands quietly behind a coffee counter, holding the world steady when it matters most.